A traditional Marxist view of history will say that originally you had some kind of primitive communism. People lived in tribes and they just shared things. It was from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. There were no classes of people. Everyone was interrelated. It was it wasn't democratic in the sense that people were necessarily voting and that each person had an equal vote, but it was accessible. The decisions that were made, you had a say, like according to your ability to produce. And so we talk about the means of production. We talk about the means of production being in the hands of the workers. So when you're a hunter gatherer and you're going out and you're hunting for food, who owns that food? Well, you don't really own it because you're part of the tribe and you owe a debt to the tribe. It's a organic whole. You don't say, "Oh, I hunted this food, therefore I own it and I'm not going to share it with anybody." You say, "No, I'm like an organ of the tribe. I'm just going out and I'm the one who does the hunting, but I'm going to share the food with everybody." Now, because you are controlling the means of production, because you are the means of production as a hunter, you are the worker. Therefore, you might have a greater say in tribal decisions, like should we move north or west or east or south or something like that. So, this is what's kind of meant by tribal communism or primitive communism. Now, the argument here is that basically, with state formation, with the invention of religion, with militaries and these kind of hierarchies coming into the fore, that this is when you have the introduction of serfdom and slavery. That people start to enslave other people either through war or either through religion, which manipulates people's psychology. And I have a huge problem with the traditional Orthodox Marxist view of state formation because I think it was developed at a time where a lot of the anthropological evidence that we now have in the way that we think about state formation has really changed in a big way. So we now know about go I'm gonna mispronounce it, Göbekli Tepe. We now know about the ancient agrarian revolution, the move away from a Paleolithic lifestyle to a Neolithic lifestyle. We know it in a lot greater detail. And so, what I feel is missing here is the acknowledgement of three classes. And this is not the three classes of the proletariat, the lumpen proletariat, the petty bourgeoisie, so on and so forth. I'm not talking about those classes. I'm talking about the warriors, the priests, and the merchants. So, in the beginning of human existence, let's say 200,000 years ago, because if you go back further than that, you can look at the difference between chimpanzees and bonobos, and chimpanzees are sort of more patriarchal, and bonobos are more sort of orgiastic and matriarchal in a way. But humans, anatomically modern humans, perhaps 200,000 years old, the Chad and the warrior is on top. So the ability to hunt, the ability to conduct warfare, is mostly a product of course, there's a mental component, but it's overwhelmingly physical in a way that a priest class or a merchant class is not physical. The warrior is a physical class. And so when we think of the warrior, we're thinking of the Rajasic type. We're thinking of someone who's not so fat that they can't run, but not someone so skinny that they can't take a punch. So this is someone who's solid, the triangular frame, someone with a jaw that's strong and wide, so if you punch them, you're going to break your own fingers. Someone who can throw a spear or swing a club or something like that. So someone who's good at agility and athletics, and they can fight and they can kill and they can hunt. So these people are the natural chieftains of the tribe, and you see this in little tribes of wolves and wolf packs, and you see this among lions, that the alpha male is the biggest, strongest male that's the best at killing and hunting. And even with the lionesses who actually do the hunting, that again, there's an alpha female there. So within the human context, following from chimpanzees, saying that the hunters were men, the gatherers were women mostly, and so the alpha male, the leader of the tribe, was the biggest Chad. He was the warrior. So the warrior ideal is something that we instinctively, psychologically look for in the same way that men instinctively know to be attracted to breasts. No one had to teach you to be attracted to breasts. You simply are attracted to breasts. And I say, well, there are African tribes where people aren't attracted to breasts. And I think that's I'm very suspicious of that sentiment. I'm very skeptical of that theory that those people are not attracted to breasts. That it's just breasts. Well, what about noses? I mean, in Western society, someone might say, oh, that's just a nose. I'm not attracted to someone's nose. But the truth is, if you actually do statistical analyses of what kind of noses are attractive, there is such a thing as an attractive nose and an unattractive nose. So when someone says, oh, I'm not attracted to noses, they're lying. They actually don't have a knowledge of their own unconscious sexual desires. So people are more sexually desiring certain shapes of noses rather than others. There is a rhinophilia. Now that could be expressed explicitly as a fetish, but for most people it is not. In the same way that someone could have an explicit foot fetish, but basically there are feet that more fit the archetype that is instinctually attractive to people. So again, I'm very suspicious of these statements of like, oh, well, African tribes people aren't attracted to breasts. I'm suspicious of that because just because they're naked all the time, you can always see the breasts and it makes them commonplace doesn't mean they aren't attractive. And so when these anthropologists go and say, well, do you report being attracted to breasts? And they say, no, I'm not really attracted to breasts in their, clicking and grunting language. I'm not really sure that that's accurate data. I think what you need to use is a penile plethysmograph. You need to measure responses to pictures of different women among these people to actually find out is this instinctual or not. But I think it's clear enough every animal on the face of the planet has to identify its own mating population, because if a male goes around trying to mate with species that are not part of its mating population, that's a pretty unsuccessful mating strategy. So every animal that has eyeballs, that has some kind of visual sensory input, it needs to be able to find its breeding population, and it doesn't do so through learned behavior, it does so instinctually. So all animals have this ability to access a visual archetype through their DNA, and I don't think it's something that's learned. Now, maybe there is like an argument about morphogenetic fields. I haven't really done the research into Rupert Sheldrake. I'm kind of just interested in just staying within the environment and the genetics, just in a simple mainstream sort of way at this point. So we have the Chad, he's on top, and there's a transition away from the warrior Chad to the priest, and this for me comes with agriculturalism. Now, there are some interesting things going on in Europe 40,000 years ago. You've got these statues of women. You've got other types of cave art, and this is going on in Israel. This is going on in Europe. This is basically going on where Homo sapiens are first meeting Neanderthals. And so, from my perspective, the initial cultural clash between the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens is probably what produces this on a genetic level, an environmental level. But in any case, really, when we start to see symbology taking off is during the Neolithic period, the agriculturalist period. And this is when you have people who, they have a food surplus. And so you did have shamans. I think shamanism is something that predates agriculturalism. But now you have an importance put upon the season. People who can organize a farm. These people, the person who's going to best be able to organize a farm is not going to be the same person who's best at hunting and conducting warfare. Okay, running a farm is a different kind of a job. And so my opinion is that the first farm organizers, the people who are instructing, okay, here's how you plant this type of thing, here's how you nourish it, Here's when you plant it. Here's when you harvest it. The people who were in charge of all that were basically priests who could look at the stars and tell different things about the seasons, and they could look at the trees and the birds and animals, and they could tell, is it going to be a harsh winter? Should we save up on grain? Is it going to be a mild winter? So they could tell these different things and conditions of drought and whatever, and they could tell through experience and through basically harmony with the environment. They could understand the rhythms of nature, and they began to occupy a more and more important role in society as agriculturalism took off. And these people were basically the first priests. Now, I distinguished that from the shamanic class, which has always existed as, herbal medicines and dancing and sex rituals and violent rituals. That's existed. Now, what I distinguish the priest from the shaman is that the priest has this knowledge that actually serves an economic function apart from these basic tribal bringing the tribe together in rituals, hierarchical rituals. Like running a farm is actually a practical task that you need a quote-unquote green thumb. You need to have some knowledge of nature. And so the warrior's not really best suited to this. The class that comes to be best suited for this is the priest class. And you see this reflected in the priestly attitude. And you see this reflected today, that the people who are best farmers are basically the most religious people. Christian fundamentalists, the Amish, Orthodox Jews, not so much big in farming, but they do some farming in Israel with vineyards and wine and stuff, olives. So that's basically my perspective on the priest, is that the shift from a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, Chad-centered, warrior-centered society starts with agriculturalism, basically allows the priest to gain all these tributes, to gain all this marginal, let's say the currency of the time is bread or grain. He can gain all this extra grain through running the farms, blessing the farms, because this is a huge thing. I mean, the success or failure of the harvest is just, everything revolves around that. So the priest comes along and says, I'm going to mediate between you and nature. And that is in a very important role. That's not the same role that the shaman had, although in many cases they do become fused, because in many ways they are the same one. So knowledge of herbology, how to heal people with herbs, is kind of a similar thing to astrology and understanding the seasons and things like that. So there is a continuity between the two, but there is a definite shift that happens as well. Okay, so agriculturalism comes about 10,000 years ago. So you have to understand instinctually that fundamentally people were ruled by warrior Chads for about 190,000 years. And then 10,000 years ago, the priest comes along. The priest says, hey, I'm the new head honcho. Now, the priest and the warrior is not destroyed. He's not outmoded. He doesn't become obsolete. But his role becomes more and more limited as the diet switches from a meat and berries diet to a grain, meat, and berries diet. And for the peasantry, for the slave class, for the majority of society, actually, they don't have meat very often. They don't have berries so often. The main staple of the diet is some kind of grain or root vegetable or something that's grown in the ground. In Nigeria, I think it's the yam. In China, I guess it's rice. So we look at these different vegetables. I think potatoes actually come from South America, so that would be the staple down there. So, they have these staples, and so the warrior is not obsolete because warfare is still very important. If a society ever said, you know what, we don't need the warriors anymore, we can have the priestly people lead us and we'll be fine, all of a sudden a bunch of warriors invade and you're done for. So you always need, it's not just the state. Like we talk about, the state needs a military, it needs a police, but the need to have violence at the margins, to have some kind of defense, to provide for defense, is something that's instrumental in human society, tribal society, whatever. So you're always going to need a warrior class around, because if you don't have one, you don't have that insurance policy, someone can just roll in and, burn down your crops and take over and enslave you and rape your women. So you need warriors. So the introduction of the priest does not make the warrior obsolete. That's an important thing. And so the priests and the warriors sort of exist in a tension with one another. We have 190,000 years, if not more, of constant, of an instinctual, archetypical sort of fetish almost for the warrior type, for the Rajasic type. Men with strong jaws, men with triangular bodies, men with low body fat, men who are athletic. We have a natural desire to identify these men and to follow them wherever they might take us. So this is why we have superheroes. This is why we have Superman and Spider-Man and Iron Man and the Hulk. And like these are all Rajasic types. And they are loved by young boys because young boys don't have a lot of ideology to work off. They're just working off their instincts for the most part. That's what their imagination is attracted to, is not learned behavior, but instinctual behavior. And the instinctual behavior is find the Rajasic type and worship him. He is your leader. So that's basic human psychology for 190,000 years. And then 10,000 years ago, the priest comes along, changes up everything with agriculturalism. Now, basically what happens is that society becomes larger and larger and larger, and agriculturalism builds upon itself, and you get an agricultural farm, turns into a village, turns into a town, turns into a city, and so on and so forth. And eventually, the economy develops to the point where, with bartering, you start to have middlemen. So I have a bunch of grain, but I need meat, or I need clothing, or I need silk, or I need something else. And so I go to the market and I try to sell my grain. Well, someone's there to buy it. He's a middleman. He's not someone who actually needs what I'm selling, but he's going to buy it because he knows he can resell it at a profit. And so this is the emergence of a merchant class. It happens basically when you have a large enough population, and that happens when you have agriculturalism. And so you see in quick succession, you had 190,000 years of warrior leadership. All of a sudden, the priests gain a new role and a new power with agriculturalism, transforming their traditional shamanic role. Again, we can argue about how much continuity there is, how much we can distinguish between the two. But I think they do gain a new role, that the role of the warrior is lessened, the warrior of the priest becomes more important. And then you have this merchant class following the development of cities, which again comes about 10,000 years ago. The earliest continuously inhabited cities, now we're talking about maybe 6,000 years ago or something. So the evolution of the priest type and the merchant type happens in quick succession. Again, for maybe 190,000 years of existence, we never had a merchant type. There was no such thing as a merchant type. There were warriors and shamans and basically everyone else who were just like trying to fit into one of those roles successfully or unsuccessfully. Then you get this merchant type. And the merchant type doesn't necessarily have any power other than he has extra currency with which to basically buy the abilities of warriors or buy the abilities of priests. And so you could have a rich merchant who then pays warriors to do warfare on his behalf, or a rich merchant who pays priests to, pray on his behalf or use their religious influence on their behalf. So the merchants start to rise to prominence. Now, what's interesting, you look at Northern Europe. Northern Europe did not experience the agricultural revolution until much, much later. And so Northern Europeans were still hunter-gatherers, even though 10,000 years ago you saw the emergence of agriculturalism in India and China and the Middle East and Egypt. You didn't see the emergence of agriculture in Northern Europe until thousands of years later. And so what actually happened is a bunch of Near Eastern migrants, Middle Eastern migrants, moved into Europe up through Greece into Europe, and they mixed in the middle with these Northern Europeans. But the Northern Europeans maintained a hunter-gatherer lifestyle much longer than these other populations. Now, that's of course true for some people of the Amazon. It's true for people maybe of the Andaman Islands. It's true for all kinds of people around the world. But it's interesting, you look at the central location of Europe in terms of a crossroads between Asia and Africa. And you also look at it in terms of, again, 40,000 years ago. This is where Homo sapiens meet Neanderthal. And also, yeah, again, you have to look at those ancient artifacts, those ancient sculptures and cave paintings that are found around Israel and around Europe and in Spanish caves. And you look at the emergence about 6,000 years ago of the Balkan culture, and there's a certain Balkan script that is perhaps distinct from the Phoenician script, and ancient. It's a pre-Indo-European civilization, so there's a lot going on in Europe. Europe's an important place. Like, cultural stuff is happening there, and we can look at ancient technologies like the bow and arrow. Some of the earliest bows and arrows are found in Germany, for example. Germany has a lot of these ancient excavations going on, again, because you're talking about the Atlantic coast, which has its own cultural technology going on, that perhaps the Clovis culture managed to make it over to North America with boats, perhaps 10,000 years ago or earlier. We're not exactly sure. But they had their own thing going on, and then the Greeks in that area had its own thing going on. And so Germany is kind of like this crossing point between the two, and a lot of important stuff's going on there. So for Northern Europe to not experience this agricultural revolution is significant in the fact that Northern Europe still is in very close proximity to a lot of important anthropological events and anthropological advancements. So this distinguishes it from, say, the Amazonian rainforest, which is just in the middle of nowhere, nothing's going on. So it's very interesting on a genetic level, on a cultural level, that the isolation of the Northern Europeans from agriculturalism, the fact that agriculturalism doesn't really work in Northern Europe. It's not something that's like very hospitable to agriculture, and so it does remain primarily a fishing and a hunting society for a long time. And from a class analysis, what this means is that Northern European society is much, 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 much more warrior-based and priestly-based rather than merchant-based, whereas the Middle East and these places that are good at agriculture, they develop a much, much more robust merchant class. And so you see this reflected in the cultural and religious and spiritual outlooks of Middle Eastern peoples. They're much more amenable to urbanism and anonymity and merchandising than Northern Europeans. Merchandising is comparatively, relativistically, a much less prominent feature in Northern Europeans. So then we start talking about the Ring of Gyges, and we start talking about the concept of a shame-based culture versus the concept of a guilt-based culture. And in the Middle East, with urbanism, you gain anonymity. If you have a city full of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, it's easy to be anonymous, and that allows you to do all kinds of immoral things without being punished. And so the idea becomes that it's advantageous to do bad things so long as you don't get caught. And you can see this reflected in a lot of Mideast culture and stories like the Ring of Gyges. The idea that you can do whatever you want so long as you don't get caught. So it's more of a shame-based culture. If you get caught, that's shameful. Take that compared to Northern European culture, much more of a guilt-based culture. If you do something wrong, you feel bad because there's no real distinction between what is seen and what is unseen. And you know this, if you ever join a cult or a commune or a very, very small group of people, we're talking about Dunbar's number, 200, 100 people, a little colony, a little camp. You join these people, and everybody knows what's going on with everybody else's business. Like, there's no secrets, there's no hiding, and so the distinction between private guilt and public shame just washes away, and there's really no distinction, evolutionary or in terms of an adaptive distinction that you would have in the Middle East with the rise of an anonymous culture, that people can go around doing graffiti, they can do theft, they can do lying, they can use deception, and they don't incur the negative consequences, they get the positive benefits. And so outwitting people and being clever and this sort of thing comes to be more and more valued, whereas in Northern Europe we're talking more of a guilt-based culture. Now you do have figures like Loki, and Loki is the trickster god. And I guess there are people who are like, the problem is that you have an actual ancient Northern European ethos and an actual ancient Northern European religion. And then you have these neo-pagans who are like trying to identify with these gods and redefine them and bring them into a modern context. And so it's hard when you're trying to find out information and do research. You have these modern neo-pagans who are like, well, we don't really care what our ancestors believe. We're just going to make something up so that we have something to call neo-paganism today and to run with, and we can just change it however we want because there's no Bible. We can just make it our own thing. It's very problematic, especially, the Marvel series is trying to take it. So there's a lot of confusing and contradictory information out there, but I'm trying to do very broad strokes and try to just speak in general terms right now. So again, Northern Europe, much more emphasis on respect of the warrior and the priest, not so much on the merchant. Middle Eastern cultures, much higher emphasis on the role of the merchant. So you fast forward through the ages. Basically, what happens is cities get larger and larger. Now we're at the present day, and the warrior has taken a backseat to technology. There's a lot that you used to need a Rajasic type man, like a man with a strong jaw and strong arms, athletic ability. You don't need that, especially after the invention of, in particular, the machine gun. It doesn't matter how strong you are, athletic you are, you cannot just run into machine gun fire. There's no way to defeat that. And so there's still commandos and special ops and people like this. But on the whole, the actual need and necessity through warfare for the Rajasic type has decreased. Of course, there's really no more need for hunting in providing nutrition. We can have factory farming. And, the priest class itself is becoming outmoded against science and Hollywood. And so these twin kind of fields, science on the one hand, and I don't know what we would call the world capital of science. Tokyo certainly does a lot of scientific research, but, you can find it in many different European capitals and American capitals. But in any case, science has basically taken over the job of explaining the world from the priest. And then you have Hollywood to dazzle people and to tickle their emotions and make them feel the feels that they want to feel, which is the traditional role of the shaman with his sex rituals and his violence rituals. He's trying to make people tap into the unconscious. So there's a lot of developments that have come along which have made the warrior much less powerful, the priest much less powerful, and by contrast, the merchant has become much more powerful. And so this is sort of the class analysis that I looked at history through. And when you have now artificial intelligence coming to the fore, replacing workers, conducting warfare, even when we talk about autonomous drones, all of this seems to point back toward a new warrior class. It's not going to be a human warrior class, but it's going to be some kind of post-human warrior class. And the question is sort of, if things are going to keep going on in the same direction they are now, people can speculate about a collapse. And that, I think, is more realistic than stagnation. I think either the whole thing is going to have to collapse, which, again, I don't think is very likely, or there's going to have to be some kind of continuance in the direction we're going on. And now I think just staying where we are is unrealistic. So if there was a collapse, my projection is that super rich billionaires would hide in nuclear bunkers underground forever how long they needed to. And really, you can store a surprisingly large amount of information and a small number of flash drives. So the information that you need to recreate the internet is something that you could actually store. I mean, I'm talking about like the internet in the 1980s or the 1990s. All of that information you could store, theoretically on some very expensive flash drives. And there's a lot of really important information that took, basically thousands of years to develop. All that information can be stored in an extremely small volume of space. If you're efficient about the way that you store it and you're selective about what information you're storing. Even, you can store all the novels that have ever been written in human history in an extremely small, and I mean, you can find all these factoids out on the internet, but we're getting we're getting very efficient at storing information, and so these billionaires could hide in their nuclear bunkers for however long they need to. Then they have all the information they need to recreate civilization. They can do it however they want. So, from my perspective, total collapse is not an option, because total collapse just sort of is going to restart the scenario, and we're going to be going in the same direction. I think, I guess there's if an asteroid hit the Earth, then we'd all be wiped out. But other than that, I don't see a total collapse scenario that's not a win for the billionaire class, because I think they're in the best position to survive something like that. Okay. I don't think stagnation is realistic, because I think systems either grow or they decay. And so either we're going to collapse or we're going to go forward. And if we go forward, the likelihood that we're going to develop an artificial intelligence system that's going to be above human intelligence, not just at human intelligence, but above human intelligence, seems to be increasing. So with that in mind, I think you are looking at the creation of a post-human sentience, and you're talking about a new warrior class. You're talking about a system that is going to be competing with other similar systems for resources, and it's going to use violence. It's going to use, whether those are computer viruses or whether that's going to be autonomous drones or whatever that kind of warfare is going to look like. But it's funny, because in the Matrix, it was all about the robots fighting the humans, which I guess on a religious level it sort of makes sense if you understand the robots as demons and we're caught in the Maya and it's a Hindu interpretation, whatever. So in terms of a mythological thing taken into the 21st century, I get that. But really, if you want to look at the Matrix, it's not going to be the robots fighting the humans. The robots aren't going to need to fight the humans. That would be like us spending all our time fighting chimpanzees. The robots are going to be spending time fighting each other. Because anytime you have a successful system that's able to diverge and evolve and adapt, you naturally have speciation. When you have speciation, you have competition. Competition means warfare. So these systems are going to be at war with one another, and they're going to be competing for resources. And they probably will see planetary exploration as something that's cheap and desirable for their own survival. So, I mean, the question is, are these things going to want to survive? Well, do viruses want to survive? Why does life want to survive? Well, it's because that which wants to survive outlives that which doesn't want to survive. So as soon as the germ of the will to survive pops into existence, that spark of life comes to be, it's very, very persistent and it's very, very powerful. And so in that sense, you could say that there's an underlying superstructure to the universe that almost continuously favors the will to live. And from that perspective, you might say that the will to live is something that's implicitly written into our reality. This will, this desire to consume resources and reproduce and propagate ourselves. So I don't know. I've gone over all these themes before, but I just wanted to isolate them, say that this is the real, the prism of reality that I'm looking at is that we had 190,000 years of a warrior-dominated society. And so psychologically, that's what we're built for. Pretty much everyone. We all like to, we all like superheroes. We all like superheroes. Furthermore, the type of women that produce Rajasic men, that's a certain beauty type, and we're attracted to those kinds of women. And furthermore, you talk about the difference between Northern Europeans and other human populations. Well, it might just have to do with the fact that they are more adapted to a hunter-gatherer society than other European populations. So there's all kinds of interesting things here, racially, technologically, religiously. And I'm just trying to look at it from this big picture. And we're going to something new here. The idea that we're just going to go back to a medieval society or a pre-industrial society or something like that, I don't think is feasible. The idea that we're going to stagnate. But that's what people want. And I think people have a huge cognitive bias. And I deal with these people who have a huge cognitive bias. And I have my own biases, right? But I try to be aware of them. And I feel like people aren't questioning their own cognitive biases. You want the 1950s. Why? Because the 1950s is the thing that you recognize as the most stable and familiar and continuous thing to your understanding of cultural norms and class norms, right? So you think the 1950s, okay, everyone's white, so they're like me. It's a patriarchy, so I benefit, and that's sustainable, and that's fine, and that's good. What people don't understand is that the seeds of the 60s were already in the 50s. You couldn't have had the 60s without the 50s. And so to look at the 50s as some kind of stable paradise, some Eden on earth, that, oh no, someone ate the apple and then we had the 1960s sexual revolution, everything got messed up, that is an extremely naive way of looking at history. And if you actually look the development of elites over centuries, the sexual revolution had its predecessors, people writing about gay rights in the 19th century. They weren't writing about gay rights in the 16th century. They weren't writing about it in the 14th century. Why is it that they were writing about it in the 19th century? Because there was a progression that over centuries degraded confidence in the Christian church, and that gave rise to a new rationalism. Of course, the ancient Greeks had their own version of rationalism, but it was a new rationalism, a new tabula rasa, a new way of looking at the world, really a new religion of humanism. And there were many different people advocating for this. There were the Freemasons, the Illuminati, these people, real people. And you have guys like Styx, X, and Hammer, who I think is, I don't know, he's at least interesting to look at for people who don't understand things, in terms of he just kind of puts it out there. Like, yeah, the Freemasons, they were people who were looking for a rational society. Well, that was a radical departure from what we traditionally had psychologically. And so these people were religious radicals, and they had a lot of elite support. I mean, the American Revolution was it was led by Freemasons. So this isn't a conspiracy theory. It's not even at this point. I'm trying to create a descriptive model of reality, a narrative of history that we can refer to, and then we can use our value judgments to say if this is good or bad. But can we at least empirically agree on what actually happened here? And then go from there. Because people seem to think that ethno-nationalism and like nation states are the natural organic thing. I just read about an interview that Tucker Carlson did with some Swiss newspaper. And he says something, he says a lot of sensible things about human psychology and adaptation to change and loss of familiarity, topics that I'm trying to focus on. And so I appreciated that. And then he said something about the EU, saying that the nation state is the organic, political unit, and they're trying to destroy that. No, it's not. The organic unit is in-group. And in-group can be anything. It can be your religious group. It can be your linguistic group. It can be your kin group. It can be your ethnic group. It can be your racial group. Anyone can make up any kind of sort of in-group that they want. Now, the nation state, the 19th century was saw as very beneficial to Freemasons because they wanted to destroy the aristocracy. The aristocracy was not an ethno-nationalist aristocracy. It was an elitist aristocracy. It was a Christian aristocracy. It was a European aristocracy. And so it was really focused on their own traditions. And so there were certain traditions that ennobled the aristocracy that made them believe they were better than other people. And it wasn't because, well, I'm a German and I'm a Frenchman and I'm an Englishman. That's not what they thought made them superior. Because they had Germans marrying Frenchmen and Frenchmen marrying British people, whatever. And to them, they even had people marrying, descendants of Genghis Khan. I mean, that's in the European aristocratic bloodline. So these people, if you look in the genealogy, but these people... fundamentally, They thought that what made them superior was their ancestral martial virtues, their spiritual virtues. They had an ethos. They had an aristocratic ethos that they believed made them better than the rest of the populace. And that's why they had the right to rule. And the merchant class and the Freemasons didn't like that, so they wanted to overthrow the aristocrats. And they said, hey, we need ethno-states. We need nation-states. We need to overthrow the aristocracy and have democratic, liberal nation-states. This is what the Revolution of 1848 was about. This is what the unification of Italy was about. This is what the unification of Germany was about. It was about breaking down the old power of the aristocracy and bringing in more room for Freemasons and rationalists and merchants to operate. Because you take away the ethos of society is no longer focused on the aristocratic ethos. It's now focused on the demos, which is more easily manipulated by the power of money, which is the power of the merchandising class. And materialism and scientific materialism and humanism. So you're looking at all these things, and ethno-nationalism in the nation state is not some kind of steady, stable state that we can just exist in forever. You look at 190,000 years of human history, it's not 190,000 years of ethno-states. It's little tribal groups and communities who in some cases might have been multiracial. Because you look at racial boundaries around the world, for instance, between sub-Saharan Africa and northern Africa. Or we're talking about ancient India. Ancient India was a melting pot of all kinds of racial groups migrating there. You had Northern Europeans getting in there. You had the Asians getting in there. So all kinds of people were migrating all over Eurasia. And so you might have a tribe that genetically is partially European, partially Asian, partially Middle Eastern, partially African. And so you can have a group of people, and take modern Puerto Ricans, for example. They're racially mixed, and yet they still have an ethnic in-group there as Puerto Ricans. So, the idea that, ethno-state is everything and that race and ethno-state, they're all connected, it's not a thorough examination of history. I mean, given the information that we have today, it's a very shallow 19th century view. It's a very Freemasonic view of how things should operate. And again, that's not how they did operate for 190,000 years. Ancient city-states were not ethno-states. They were multiracial, cosmopolitan areas where you'd have a ruling class might be one ethnicity and the slave class might be another ethnicity. The priest class might be another ethnicity. The merchant class might be another ethnicity, and it could be subdivided into, one ethnicity dominates the clothing market and one ethnicity dominates the grain selling market or whatever. And we see this in the modern world, right? We see Indians own all the 7-Elevens, and the Chinese, they own the laundromats, and some people own the banks and whatnot and so forth. And so we see these kinds of ethnic niches forming. And that's been happening for a very, very long time. Longer than the lifespan of these so-called ethno-states. And so it's obvious that people, if you speak the same language, you can better communicate. And if you can better communicate, you can better have political unity. All other things being equal. Now, of course, we've seen situations in history where Christians ally with Muslims against other Christians. We've seen that happen in the medieval era. But again, all other things being equal, we can presuppose that if you speak the same language, you have a better time forming a political unit. So Americans, if they all speak English, which is less and less the case, but let's say they all speak English, Chinese all speak Chinese, to form a single political unit between the United States of America and China, where we would have one Congress, and it would be, I guess it would be like 75% Chinese speaking and 25% English speaking. It would be a mess. It would be a terrible political unit. It would be just prone to disunity. And so obviously you want some kind of linguistic continuity if you're forming a political entity from a localist perspective. From the perspective of the demos has some kind of power. The demos has the ability. And originally it wasn't the demos itself. It wasn't one man, one vote. It was one aristocrat, one vote. And so it'd be one landowner, one vote. And so you can see, when you look at Germany, you can say, well, Germany is descended from the three kingdoms of Charlemagne's descendants, and there was a Western Frankish Empire and an Eastern Frankish Empire and a Middle Frankish Empire, and then they diverged into France, Italy, and Germany. And so this is not to say that we have to exclude ethnicity in our analysis of history. I'm not saying take race and take ethnicity out of the equation and throw it out. I'm just saying it's not the only factor. In a lot of cases, it's not even the most significant factor. The Austro-Hungarian Empire obviously had a German ethnic core to it, and yet it included a lot of other ethnicities. And so, was it weak because it had all these different ethnicities? Well, that's how most empires were. For most of the time, is that you had multiple different ethnic groups speaking multiple different languages. You look at France. France, Brittany, the Celtic-speaking region, used to be larger. Southern France, Occitania, again, different from standard French, and that difference has lessened and lessened over the years. There's been an assimilation process. So you see all these internal differences and internal divides within political units, and that's been going on forever. The idea that, we just lived in this world of ethnostates, this stagnant world of perfect ethnostates, and then all of a sudden the globalists came around and cultural Marxism just came out of nowhere and just destroyed all these pure, beautiful ethnostates, as if the Russian Empire was an ethnostate or any of these empires were ethnostates. I don't know. Where is this golden age of ethnostates? Tell me this golden Wilsonian age where everyone was just neatly divided into political units and each state had its own ethnic makeup and linguistic makeup. Tell me this golden age and tell me how we're going to get to this new golden age. I don't see it happening. I don't see that being the direction the world is moving in. When we talk about the importance of ethnicity and the importance of linguistics, one place I see it being extremely important is in the case of warfare. Because if you're a commander and you can't communicate with your soldiers, that's a big problem. If you're a commander and your soldiers are a different ethnicity from you, that's also a big problem. So ethnic solidarity in the military is extremely important. That's part of the reason why in America, even though diversity is our strength, special ops, the Marines, basically the more rigorous the military unit is, the more white it is. And that's why the Marines is the whitest branch of the military and the Navy is the least white branch. So you look at this and you have to admit that if you live in a warrior-based society, racial purity, ethnic purity, linguistic purity is a lot more important for the basic functioning of that society, the more dependent that society is on activities like hunting and warfare. And that might be why Northern Europe is one of the most homogeneous places on Earth. On the other hand, you look at, the Middle East and all these very racially mixed places, and you see all different kinds of people. Perhaps that's because of the power of the merchant class versus the importance of the warrior class in society. So, again, it's when we talk about race, to me, race is not something stagnant. Race is something that can change and is subject to constant pressures. And these pressures, I call class pressures because I define these three classes, warriors, priests, and merchants. And the power of these classes and the economic situation of the society or the populations under question, that's going to determine the future of those populations. So because Northern Europe is now part of a merchant capitalist system, its racial demographic situation is changing immensely because it is under the domination of merchandising elites. Warrior elites no longer rule Northern Europe. At one point they did, and they did so for a lot longer than other parts of Europe. But that has changed today, and so as a result, the racial, ethnic, demographic situation has changed. So to me, race is something that follows class dynamics. Race isn't something that creates class dynamics. Race is something that is a consequence of class dynamics. Race is constantly put under pressure. Races are defined and created and maintained according to the class dynamics that they are subject to. So being subject to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle is going to give an advantage to the warrior class, and that's going to impact the racial characteristics of that population. Is it more Rajasic? Is it more Tamasic? Is it more Sattvic? You look at India and the way that it dealt with the balance between the warrior, the priest, and the merchant. And I think we can safely say that in Asia generally, and especially India, the Sattvic priestly type has a lot more power there, perhaps, than in other societies. Even Iran with Zoroastrianism, we could even talk about ancient Egypt and the importance of priests there, although the warrior class had a big influence, at least from a biblical perspective. So this is the primary analysis that I'm using to look at history and look at the future. You have a bunch of white nationalists running around who are like, we need to get back our white ethno-state. And I'm asking, for what purpose? If we're really headed toward artificial intelligence, a point where 30% of people are going to be unemployed in the next 20 years, a revolutionary change in the economy, people being paid, universal basic income just to be parasites, basically, what's going to happen to these people? Well, I think psychologically they're just going to choose to drop out of the breeding population. They're just going to stop having kids. These people are going to do a self-genocide. They're self-select out of the population. And so you're going to see radical depopulation, which has been predicted many, many times over, hundreds of years even. You're going to have radical depopulation. Alex Jones would drone on and on about this as some big scary thing. This is something that is going to happen. And automation is going to take over. And at that point, all that's going to matter is who's at the top. And the question is, are we going to have advanced enough artificial intelligence to be ruling our society? Or is it going to still be human actors? And so that's really the only question at that point. If you have an automated military with, self-driving, self-shooting drones, and you have, cyber warfare, and you have economic warfare and all these things, the merchant class is dominating. The warrior class has really no practical function whatsoever. And the priest class just goes into Hollywood and the university system and science, social science, and even STEM. So you look at that situation, it's like, in the grand scheme of things, in the vast span of history, we are in a completely new epoch. And so to be arguing for like an ethno-state, white nationalism at this point seems historically irrelevant. What it seems to me is the cry of a people who are deeply disturbed by change. And that's natural. And I sympathize with that. I sympathize with the desire for familiarity, continuity, and in-group. Those are natural desires. In the same way that sex is a natural desire. So I don't look at people who desire sex and I don't say, oh, you evil white nationalist person. Like, I don't have that, I don't look at people who want these things as evil. I see them as following their instincts, but they're doing so ignorantly. And so I'm not angry at these people. And I have this, I'm also human. I also have the same instincts, but I recognize the instincts for what they are. They are something that evolved to make me fit and to make the population that I was a part of fit. To have all these instincts are something that my ancestors evolved these instincts, a desire for familiarity, continuity, in-group, to help protect the tribal society. They were there to help protect our reproductive fitness. But at this point, you're looking at the massive changes facing us. And these ancient instincts are actually working against the quickly changing environment that we're living in. When you quickly change an environment, so let's take a cat and throw the cat into the ocean. Well, the cat physically is not built to live in the ocean. So the cat in itself would need to change, maybe even on a genetic level, in order to be better suited for the ocean. I don't know. The cat couldn't change, and maybe we have to ask ourselves, are we even capable of change on the level that we need to change in order to adapt to this new environment? The answer could be yes, it could be no. I think it's really a question of, do you think we're going to augment human intelligence, or are we going to create separate and distinct artificial intelligence that's going to be totally different from humanity and totally disconnected from us. Uh, I can't really predict at this point which one it's going to be. But obviously, there are going to be some people who can't adapt. And that is why I think, in general, ethnocentrism in itself, devoid of any context, is a kind of nostalgia. It is a kind of just feeding of the instincts. And that's why I call it pornographic, because we have a sexual instinct, like we want to have sex, okay? We all understand this. This is just, we don't need to lie about it. We don't need to sugarcoat it. We all have this and we all want to satisfy it. The question is, to what extent should we satisfy our instincts given our new environment? Now, in the past, if you wanted to have sex, you had to find a partner willing to have sex with you. And in order to find these partners, you would have to gain social status within your tribe or in-group. You would have to look good physically, which takes effort. You would have to have good social skills. You might have to have a good reputation. These are all things that you might need, or you could just do the old Viking way and just go raid and rape and pillage and whatever. But in either case, you had to put in effort in order to gain sexual resources. With the internet, with pornography, with Hollywood, you don't need to put in any effort anymore. You can just consume sexual resources as a stimulant, as a simulation on your computer. So you can do that. The question is, should you? Should you just sit around indulging your ancient instincts in this new and novel way, in like a drug? I mean, it's like dopamine. We have dopamine. Dopamine serves a function. Dopamine is not an accident. Dopamine is intentional. We have we have dopamine receptors in the brain, which are meant to encourage behavior. Now, in the ancient past, these dopamine receptors worked quite well for our evolutionary benefit. At this point, with things like cocaine and weed and all of these drugs that affect our and weed affects your dopamine receptors, it makes you feel good. All of this produces addiction. All of this, you're injecting basically happiness into your body. Is that something you should do? You have to really ask yourself that. You as an individual, do you just want to sit in front of the computer basically feeding yourself, feeding your sexual instinct? Do you want to feed your dopamine receptors? Do you want to feed your ethnocentrism? Do you just want to feed it, feed it, feed it? That's really the question. And if you reject that and you say, no, I don't want to just sit here feeding myself because that's disgusting, parasitic, and consumptive, and that's not what an elite looks like. An elite doesn't just look like a consuming class. An elite is something that has self-control and willpower and has the forethought to and the sattvic quality of being able to forestall our instincts and pursue adaptive change. That's a quality of an elite. So, no, we reject that. And then at that point, you have to say, do we just accept ethnocentrism as something that worked in the past and therefore it must work in the future? Or do we understand the changing conditions and say, look, we're working under a completely different paradigm? And again, there are three classes. We have to understand how these three classes operate in modern society. The Rajasic type, the warrior type, has basically become subsumed into Hollywood. If you want to find the most masculine men, the most athletic men, look toward the entertainment industry. And I include sports in the entertainment industry. So you're looking at football, soccer, you're looking at Hollywood movies, you're looking at action movies, and you're looking at superhero movies. This is what you're looking for. And so basically, the warrior class is completely controlled, and even, the military industrial complex, completely controlled by the merchant class. And so if you want to tap into the power of the warrior class, you're really talking about working with the merchant class. If someone becomes a bodybuilder, it's not because of functional strength. No one needs functional strength. That doesn't give you power. George Soros is not a bodybuilder. People don't get rich and powerful anymore by bodybuilding. Now, in the ancient past, for 190,000 years, being physically strong gave you a pretty good chance that you were going to be able to monopolize sexual resources in the tribe. Not the case anymore. So if someone is going to increase their physical power, from a practical standpoint in the current world, that would only be powerful insofar as it's helping you control a media perception of yourself. And so, like, CEOs will be taller than 6 foot and they'll be well built, not because that functional strength allows them to conduct warfare or to gather, or to hunt. It's because it changes people's perception of them. And people's perception of you actually is very important for forming networks and for getting people to follow you and lead you. If you look physically impressive, you look good, people will just follow you. Whether the facts are there or whether it's logical or whatever, people will just follow you. That's something powerful. So looking like the warrior type and acting like the warrior type is not something that's actually outmoded, but there's still power in that. So to understand the warrior type as a class, understand how you develop those virtues is still relevant and important insofar as it affects the psychology of other human beings who, even if you're conscious of that, even if you understand everything I've explained so far, it's still not going to prevent you necessarily from looking at a Rajasic type, a warrior type, and saying, wow, that guy looks like a leader. He looks like someone I should follow. And the corresponding, again, there is a certain female type that produces a Rajasic type, and that has certain proportions and whatnot. And then, of course, you can look at the Sattvic type and religion and priestly philosophy and that mentality and understand the power behind that. And finally, you can look at merchandising and willpower and the ability to have patience, the ability to study for long hours, the ability to deal with extremely boring and abstract material, the ability to, do what an accountant does. An accountant just looks at numbers and they're very boring, and it's something that you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You don't have to have a huge IQ to be an accountant. You just have to have a whole lot of patience. So in the merchant type, there is a great deal of patience. There is a great deal of abstraction. So looking at these three virtues, you can explore those. You can see what you're good at, and you can see where you can improve and sort of what your niche is, because you can work on your weaknesses to an extent, but at some point you hit a wall, and that wall is different for different people in different regions. And so because of the principle of specialization, you do eventually want to find what you're best at and focus on that and really grow it. And so this is what I encourage people to do, and to join me in doing, and to do in a communal way. I think that operating within a communal framework, and right now it's online. Of course, it would be better if it was person to person. I think that's always the case. Whenever you're in person with other people, the communal aspect is much stronger. But it can start weekly online, and even to an extent, there is a merchandising aspect in terms of the fact that it is not person to person. It's more abstract, an abstraction of community rather than a visceral community. And you see that in medieval scholasticism, priests are sending letters back and forth in order to reform their spiritual ideas, especially in the 12th century. So there is a historical precedent for what I'm talking about, forming a community around understanding the three classes, developing your virtues, looking at history from a 200,000 year perspective, looking at the developments that have happened, looking at the developments that are coming, and trying to organize yourself within that. Really, there are going to be winners and losers here. From any perspective, there are going to be winners and losers in the case of a collapse. If you're not ready for a collapse, you will be a loser. If you are ready, you're going to be a winner. Now, I'm not advocating survivalism, but even survivalists, because I think just, billionaires are going to be better at it than a middle-class guy or even upper-middle-class guy. But in any case, at least that dynamic of winners and losers is true. That there will be some people who are prepared for future changes and some people who are not. And you have to ask yourself the question, do you just want to consume while the consumption is good, or do you want to try to prepare for the future? Do you want to try to be part of the people who go on? And I've spoken so far in purely materialistic terms because I think that's how most people are trained to think. But you can also introduce a spiritual dimension to this. You can talk about reincarnation. You can ask yourself, do you want to be reincarnated into universes where each life you spend more and more of your life just consuming things and fulfilling your instincts, whether it's the need for sex or the need for in-group and familiarity and comfort and bourgeoisie, stability, all these things. Are you just going to sit around just consuming these things, or are you going to adventure and explore and create and jump out of your comfort zone and do those sort of things? What sort of choice would you like to go in? What sort of direction do you want to go in? And of these three types, what's your ideal type? Would you like to be the ideal warrior, the ideal priest, the ideal merchant? Are you trying to do a mixture of the three? It's not just how do you want to live your life for this one life, because often people will say something like, well, the future is hopeless, so why bother trying to be good at anything, because the singularity is coming, we're all going to die, whatever. But if you believe in reincarnation, then there is a purpose to how you live your life, because it determines the course of your next life. Because whatever you do in this life, whatever path you start on, and whatever direction you veer yourself in, every choice that we make, every habit that we form, ask yourself, what kind of habits do you have? How do you live your life? How do you use your free time? Everyone has free time. How do you use your free time? How do you choose to live your life? Now take the decisions that you make on a daily basis and look at the average. Are you just swimming with the current? Are you mediocre? Are you going with the average? Then you're going to be more and more mediocre as time goes on. Are you diverging from the average? If you're diverging from the average, what direction are you going to? What is the logical conclusion of that? If you did that for 1,000 lifetimes over and over again, that each lifetime you veer a little bit more and more away from the average, what extreme are you headed toward? Are you headed toward an extreme of consumption? Are you headed toward an extreme of production? So these are the kind of questions that I want people asking themselves, and I want people developing themselves, and I want people changing themselves outside the framework of we need to get Trump reelected. Because, again, whether reincarnation is true, or whether, the development of these three classes that I've talked about is true, and their future development, whatever, and again, these are kind of the scenarios, this is the, how should I say, this is the bubble that I'm trying to say encompasses, like, reasonable things to think about the future. Getting Trump reelected can be a part, maybe, of some larger goal, but that can't be the end goal. And even the ethno-state, I think that is not an end goal, because you need to maintain that it's something that is seems less and less realistic in view of history and in view of the changing technological and class warfare landscape. So, what is the real objective here? I am not a billionaire. And so if I was, I would be against the dissemination of truth. I would want to monopolize the truth. I'm not a billionaire, and so I don't want to monopolize the truth. I want to spread the truth, and I want to learn the truth. And communally, I think truth seeking is something that I can't just do alone, because I'm not the smartest at everything. I try to be really smart on a couple of subjects, and even then I'm not the smartest person on those subjects. So I need other people to help me. And there are a lot of people who are smarter than me who maybe they just aren't tapped into breaking certain taboos. So people have taboos against looking at the world through an ethnocentric lens. Other people have a taboo where they can't look outside of that ethnocentric lens. So I'm saying, let's help each other break down these taboos, because there are a lot of smart people out there who really what's inhibiting them is not their intelligence, but their taboos. Now, moving away from the political realm, there are people who are just afraid. There are people who are afraid of getting on YouTube. There are people afraid of disturbing reality, almost. Like, reality is this fragile thing and they have to avoid disturbing it. And And I understand that. Like, if you're trying to build a career in the mainstream, then talking about truth and talking about what is important is scary to people. And people almost understand instinctively that high status people don't talk about what's true because high status people don't want to share the truth. If you're a high status person, you want to monopolize the truth. Uh, so, almost people, when you ape a high status person, when you're trying to fake it till you make it, then you want to avoid telling the truth. You want to speak in terms of platitudes, and that's what's really seen as the most high status form of speech, is to avoid any uncomfortable subject. And I guess if you want to succeed in the world, you have to love the world. People who hate the world, people who hate who they are never going to succeed. You have to love yourself, you have to love the world. Now, when I say succeed, I'm obviously talking about succeeding in the world. If you don't want to succeed in this world, but you want to succeed in the kingdom of heaven, then maybe it's okay to hate the world. That's kind of like a Jehovah's Witness or even just a general Christian perspective, is that you kind of think the world's run by Satan and you want to get away from it as far as possible, and you hate the things of the world and you love the things of God. And that's a certain definition of what it means to succeed. So, I guess you have to choose in your own mind. You have to decide what kind of success you want. Where do you want to succeed? Do you want to succeed in the world, or do you want to succeed in some kind of heavenly kingdom, according to some kind of heavenly rules? Is this world like a test where all these fruits are put out, all these temptations are put out, all these seductions are put out, and you have to resist the test? You have to say, no, I reject the things of the world, I reject self-defense, I reject the physical body, I reject sexuality, I reject all of that, and I'm just with God. Is that the test that we're being given, and we have to pass this test in order to achieve a higher level of reincarnation, to eventually achieve some kind of enlightenment or merging with nirvana or return to divinity? It's kind of Gnostic in a way, rejecting the material world in order to gain some kind of higher spiritual enlightenment or unity with divinity. It's questionable. I almost think you have to, at some point, realistically evaluate yourself and evaluate who you are and where you're going, and asking yourself, am I the kind of person who is even set up to succeed in the world? Because if reincarnation is true, then you chose this life, essentially. The situation, basically your parents, you chose your parents. And so if your parents gave you a messed up life, and they gave you a messed up personality, and that's what you have to work with, and you're like, I'm never going to be successful, I have too many psychological hang-ups. A politician needs to be someone who comes from a good family background. I don't have that. So that's one sort of test you could do on yourself and say, am I meant for success in this world? Because if you are, then you're going to be set up. I mean, even people like, I guess, Steve Jobs didn't have a father. So there are a lot of people who come from fatherless homes who go on to be successful. So that's not, I think, probably the biggest thing is your relationship with mother. Do you have a good relationship with your mother? If so, maybe you're meant to be a materially successful person. If you don't have a good relationship with your mother, you're probably doomed to failure on a number of levels. I mean, in terms of dating, women like men who have a good relationship with their mother. In terms of the business world or politics or whatever, having a good relationship with your mom, pretty important psychologically. If you don't, I mean, a lot of serial killers have terrible relationships with their mom, and I think when we look at serial killers, they're really just an extreme version of a normal person's psychology. So they take normal problems that people have and they bring them to the extreme. So things like sadism. People have sadism, but they don't take it to that extreme. I think that's a huge indication. You have to understand probably relationship with your mother. And so if it's a good relationship, maybe you're meant to be a materially successful person. If it's a bad relationship, what does that mean? It means, like, in a karmic way, your mother is the gateway into this world. And so if you're in harmony with your mother, if you're in harmony with your gateway into the world, then you're kind of at peace with your entry into the world. And so that might be fortuitous for your material success, and that you're in harmony with reproduction, you're in harmony with the world, you're in harmony with your future advancement. But if you're antagonistic toward your mother and you have this troubled relationship, then you're probably not meant to be of this world. You're probably against this world in some way. And so then you have to work out, okay, what is the best or healthiest or truest way that I can be in opposition to the world? And is there a way to sort of make my opposition to the world something more than just sadistic misanthropy? Because that's what the serial killer does. The serial killer just goes full on sadist, full on misanthrope. But is there a way to take your opposition to the world and make it something good? That's what the priest does. That's what the sattvic priest does. So my contention is that warriors in general, merchants in general, have a good relationship with their mothers because they're successful materially in the world. Priests, perhaps not so. And so I think the priest caste in general is the way that you take that potential for misanthropy, that potential for hating the world, and you sublimate it into something, or you redirect it into something that can be positive for other people. I don't know, how easily I can argue, and I try to do this. I meet misanthropic people and I try to argue them into a position of like, hey, why don't you join up with the community? Why don't you, like, you have a unique perspective. Why don't you share that with other people? And they're filled with a lot of fear and they're filled with a lot of anxiety. So perhaps just alleviating the fear, alleviating the anxiety, trying to overcome that, trying to, I mean, at that point, if you hate the world and you hate yourself and you're just full of all this negativity, then I'm not even sure what is the point. What's the point of what is the point of indulging your fear? Fear is an instinct that we have. Anxiety, these are instincts that we have. They evolved for reasons, right? They're not useless. They serve us in certain ways. They prevent us from being harmed. But if you really hate the world, if you're really suicidal and you're really negative, then why indulge in this negativity? I think a great life struggle for someone who is so negative, and I get these people, interacting with me on my channel or otherwise, and it's a really interesting problem to me of how do you take these people and not necessarily reintegrate them into society, but how do you make them part of a larger puzzle? How can you use? I mean, they have a very different perspective, and is there a way that you could integrate that difference of perspective with a more holistic system? Is there a way to integrate these people psychologically? So I would frame it in terms of, if you come into the world into a very negative situation, it's sort of your duty to work out that negative situation and work it out in a way that ultimately can benefit people, in that you're sharing your perspective with other people. I just want to highlight a channel that I found fascinating. So I did the whole True to Old Tom. This is the John David Ebert channel, and it's the story of my life, an electronic autobiography by John David Ebert. And I only watched part one, and it was fascinating to me. This guy was talking about all this negative experience that he had, and he's just a very interesting guy. So I don't even know what he believes. I think he's read Schopenhauer, but I don't really know a lot about him except he's recommended by True to Old Tom, and it just fascinates me. And Chris Langan has a very similar story of being abused as a child, and he's a very intelligent guy and he has a very unique perspective. So I'm interested in these people, and how can people deal with and understand negativity? Like, I'm interested in white nationalism because it's an extremely negative, pessimistic thing. I've always been fascinated with these people. I've always been fascinated with Spengler and who's the French. I'm trying to think of the French eugenicist now. the aristocrat. I'm just gonna search it while I'm talking about it. I've always been fascinated with like these supremely pessimistic people, these Nazis who think like, if we don't defeat the Jews, like the entire world's gonna come crashing down. It's gonna be a cosmic graveyard. And let's see, French. De Gobineau. I didn't even. I just have to think of the keywords. De Gobineau is this French pessimist who thinks that dysgenics is going to destroy civilization. The aristocracy is going to be driven into a mass populace, a mob of people. It's going to destroy high culture. So these pessimists, they've always interested me because they have a different perspective on things. People have a cognitive bias toward just like hoping everything's going to be all right. And you talk to a vast majority of people, they don't even care about the future. And what I appreciate about pessimists, people like de Gobineau, people like even Goebbels, that sort of perspective, not their beliefs necessarily. They could even have very different. I mean, de Gobineau was philo-Semitic, so I'm not purely speaking about anti-Semites here. But white nationalists and pessimists generally, Savitri Devi, all these people, they interest me because they're a very small category of people who care about the future and who think it's going to be worse than it currently is. Whereas most people, they either just don't care. They're like, yeah, I think things will be all right. That's the vast majority of people. They either don't care or they think things are going to be okay. Whereas these pessimists, Spangler, de Gobineau, Goebbels, Savitri Devi, the white nationalist movement in general has a whole lot of pessimism in it. And so it's interesting to me, you have these people who are willing to confront the future, they care about the future, and yet they're supremely pessimistic about that. So that's a very interesting psychological state. And I have to wonder where it comes from, and the way that is it perhaps self-serving? Because I always have to question everyone's motives. Is how we are living self-serving in some way? So being pessimistic, is that a confirmation of our own internal biases? Is it an explanation for why we're not successful? I'm not successful because I don't have a white ethno-state. If I had a white ethno-state, then I would be a normal functioning person. Is it in some ways just an excuse? But I think it's interesting, and I think it could be mobilized as a positive force in society because we need people who are willing to be realists, who are willing to confront the future, who care about the future, and who are willing to pursue the truth even if it turns out to be ugly, even if it turns out to be scary. They're willing to confront that. And at least, even if I don't agree with white nationalists, at least they are people who care about the future, they're willing to confront the future, and even if it's scary, even if it's terrible, even if it's ugly, even if it's not what they want, they're still willing to think about it and consider it. Whereas most people are just too psychologically weak to even enter into that frame of mind. And so already the white nationalist strikes me as a psychologically strong type. It doesn't mean that they don't have their own problems. And certain ideologically, I think they don't understand history. I think they're trapped in this very, very specific nation-state model of reality that's not really how humanity has organized itself for its vast, vast history. And I don't think that's how things are going to be organized in the future. But there's a psychological tendency here that I find interesting, and that's why I like to engage with these people, interact with them, and bring up points and sort of attract them and talk to them because I think it's the basic psychology behind it is interested. So fundamentally, that's what I'm more interested in than their ideology itself, which I find myself more and more disagreeing with. But I think that's all for today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.